During Thanksgiving, my brother called me a failure. Those words hit me like a slap across the face in front of our entire family. The turkey went cold, the laughter died, and in that moment, I realized that the person I'd looked up to my entire life had just shattered something inside me that I didn't even know could break. But what happened next? What my uncle exposed about him? It would change everything I thought I knew about my own family. If this story hits you in the gut like it did me, please hit that like button and subscribe. Because sometimes the most painful family moments lead to the most shocking revelations, and I need you here with me as I tell you how one Thanksgiving dinner turned my entire world upside down. The smell of cinnamon and sage should have been comforting. It always had been before. But standing in Mom's kitchen that Thursday morning, watching her fuss over the stuffing recipe she'd made the same way for 23 years, I felt this strange knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. Maybe it was because I knew David was coming. My older brother, David Goldenchild, successful lawyer, owner of the perfect house in the perfect neighborhood with the perfect wife and 2 perfect kids. The one who never missed an opportunity to remind me how different our lives had turned out. "Amber, honey, can you check on the sweet potatoes?" Mom called over her shoulder, her graying hair escaping from the messy bun she always wore when she cooked. I opened the oven door, and the blast of heat felt like a preview of what was coming. Because that's the thing about family gatherings. They have this way of exposing all the wounds you thought had healed. "They look good, Mom," I said, closing the oven with more force than necessary. She turned to look at me then, really look at me, with those concerned mother eyes that could see right through any mask you tried to wear. "You okay, sweetheart? You seem tense." How could I tell her that I'd been dreading this day for weeks? That every family gathering felt like stepping into a courtroom where I was always the defendant and David was the prosecutor? That at 28 years old, I still felt like I was failing some test I didn't even know I was taking. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about work stuff." Work stuff. That was one way to put it. 3 months ago, I'd finally worked up the courage to quit my soul-crushing corporate job to pursue my dream of becoming a freelance graphic designer. It was terrifying and exhilarating and the scariest thing I'd ever done. Some months were good. Others, well, let's just say ramen noodles had become a food group. But I was happy. For the first time in years, I was actually happy. The front door slammed, followed by the sound of expensive shoes clicking across Mom's hardwood floors. My stomach dropped. "We're here!" David's voice boomed through the house, loud and confident, like everything else about him. I heard his wife Sarah's laugh, musical and perfect, followed by the excited chatter of my 7-year-old nephew Jake and 5-year-old niece Emma. Under normal circumstances, I adored those kids. But today, even their innocent joy felt like another reminder of everything I didn't have. "Uncle Amber." Jake's voice got closer, and suddenly he was barreling into the kitchen, launching himself at my legs with the fearless enthusiasm only children possess. "Hey there, buddy," I said, ruffling his dark hair. At least the kids didn't judge me for my life choices. Yet, Emma followed close behind, more reserved, but equally sweet. And for a moment, the knot in my stomach loosened. These two were pure love, uncomplicated, and genuine. Then David walked in. He looked exactly like what he was. Successful, confident, expensive. His suit probably cost more than I made in a month. His watch definitely did. He surveyed Mom's kitchen like he was appraising it for sale, and when his eyes landed on me, I saw that familiar flicker of, what was it? Disappointment? Pity? "Amber," he said, nodding like I was a distant acquaintance rather than his sister. "David," I replied, matching his cool tone. Sarah appeared behind him, perfectly styled in a way that probably took 2 hours and several expensive products. She was kind enough, but we'd never really clicked. How could we? We lived in completely different worlds. Amber, how are you? She asked with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. Still doing the art thing? The art thing. As if my entire career pivot was just a cute hobby I'd grow out of. Graphic design, I corrected, keeping my voice level. And yes, still doing it. That's nice, she said. The pause saying everything she didn't quote T.Mom bustled around us, playing peacekeeper like she always did, asking about the drive and the kids' school and anything else that might steer us away from the landmines that seemed to be buried everywhere in our family conversations. Dad appeared from the living room where he'd been watching football and probably hoping the game would drown out whatever drama was brewing in his kitchen. He was a good man, my dad, but he'd never been great at handling conflict. His strategy was usually to pretend it didn't exist until it went away. David, good to see you, son, he said, pulling my brother into one of those backslapping hugs that men do. Then he turned to me. How's my girl? Good, Dad. Really good. And I meant it, mostly. Despite the financial uncertainty, despite the way my family looked at me like I'd lost my mind, I was good. I was following my passion, building something from nothing, learning and growing and becoming the person I was meant to be. But try explaining that to people who measured success purely in salary figures and job titles. Uncle Rick showed up about an hour later, just as we were putting the finishing touches on dinner. He was Dad's younger brother, and in many ways, he was my favorite family member. Rick had always been the black sheep, the one who marched to his own drummer, and maybe that's why I'd always felt a kinship with him. He quote, "D never married, never, had kids, and he'd spent most of his adult life traveling the world as a freelance photographer. Family gatherings were hit or miss with him. Sometimes he'd show up with incredible stories and gifts from whatever exotic location he'd just returned from, and sometimes he wouldn't show up at all. But today, he was here, and he looked different. There was something in his eyes, something sharp and focused that I'd never seen before. Rick! Mom practically sang, throwing her arms around him. I wasn't sure you'd make it. Wouldn't miss it, he said, but he was looking past her, his gaze moving between David and me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. We gathered around the dining room table that had hosted countless family meals, but this one felt different. Charged, like there was electricity in the air just waiting for the right moment to spark. Dad said grace, the same simple prayer he'd been saying, for as long as I could remember, and we began to eat. For a while, the conversation stayed safe. The kids' activities, the weather, Mom's new book club. But I could feel David's eyes on me, could sense him building up to something. He had that look he got when he was preparing to cross-examine, a witness. And I had a sinking feeling I knew who his target was going to be. It started small, the way these things always do. So, Amber, he said, cutting into his turkey with surgical precision. How's the freelancing going? Making enough to pay the bills? There it was, the first shot across the bow. It's going well, I said carefully. I'm building my client base, getting good feedback on my work. That's not what I asked, he pressed. I asked if you're making enough money. The table went quiet. Even the kids seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Money isn't everything, David, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Easy to say when Mom and Dad are probably still helping you out. David, Mom warned, but he was just getting started. What? I'm just asking legitimate questions. She quits a good job to chase some fantasy, and we're all supposed to pretend that's a smart decision? It wasn't a fantasy, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. It was a choice. My choice. Right. Your choice to throw away a steady income and health insurance to play artist. I'm not playing anything. The words exploded, out of me before I could stop them. I'm building a business, I'm following my passion. I'm trying to create something meaningful instead of just existing in some corporate machine that doesn't give a damn about me. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. Could hear Emma's fork scraping against her plate. David set down his silverware and looked at me with something that might have been pity if it weren't so condescending. "Amber," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of fake patience you'd use with a child having a tantrum. "You're 28 years old. When are you going to grow up and stop chasing these ridiculous dreams? When are you going to accept that you're just not cut out for this entrepreneur thing? Face it. You're a failure." The word hung in the air like a physical thing, ugly and sharp and designed to cut deep. A failure. I felt something crack inside my chest, felt years of self-doubt and family pressure and societal expectations come crashing down on me all at once. The faces around the table blurred as tears I refused to shed burned behind my eyes. But before I could respond, before I could even process what he'd just said to me, Uncle Rick's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "That's interesting, David," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Really interesting that you'd call your sister a failure." David turned to look at him and I saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty? Fear? "Rick, this is between me and—" "No," Rick interrupted, and now there was steel in his voice. "No, I don't think it is. See, I've been sitting here listening to you tear down your sister, watching you try to make her feel small and worthless, and I keep wondering, what gives you the right? I'm just trying to help her see reality." "Whose reality?" Rick leaned forward, his eyes never leaving David's face, "Because I know some things about your reality that might surprise everyone at this table." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's face had gone pale, and I saw his hand tremble slightly as he reached for his water glass. "I don't know what you think you know," David said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. Rick smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who'd cornered its prey. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I know," he said quietly. "The question is, do you want me to share it with everyone, or would you prefer to apologize to your sister and keep this family dinner from turning into something you'll really regret?" The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken threats. I looked back and forth between them, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. What did Rick know? What could possibly make my confident, arrogant brother look like he was about to be sick? David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His perfect composure was cracking, and I could see something desperate creeping into his eyes. "Rick, please," he whispered, and in those two words, I heard something I'd never heard from my brother before, fear. But Rick wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes still locked on David's face, and said the words that would change everything. "Tell them about Miami, David. Tell them about what really happened at that conference last month." Miami. The word hung in the air like a death sentence, and I watched my brother's face crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. Whatever happened in Miami, it was bad. Bad enough to make the most arrogant man I knew look like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. "I don't know what you're talking about," David stammered, but his voice cracked on the last word, betraying him completely. Rick's smile grew wider, colder. "Really? You don't remember the Henderson and Associates conference? The one where you were supposedly closing that big merger deal?" Sarah looked confused, glancing between her husband and Rick. Of course he remembers. That's the deal that got him the promotion. David worked so hard on that. "Did he?" Rick interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like a blade. "Tell me, Sarah, did David ever show you any of the conference? Materials? Any photos from the event? Any proof that he was actually working?" I saw David's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. His hands were shaking now, actually shaking, and I felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread washing over me. Mom looked between them, her face pale with confusion and growing alarm. "Rick, what are you saying?" But Rick wasn't looking at Mom. His eyes were fixed on David like a hawk watching a mouse, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but deadly. "I'm saying that while David here was supposedly working 16-hour days to close this career-making deal, I happened to be in Miami myself. Photography assignment for National Geographic. 3-week shoot covering the art scene in South Beach." The blood drained from David's face completely. He looked like he might actually pass out. "And you know what's funny about Miami?" Rick continued, his tone conversational but his eyes hard as steel. "It's a small world when you're staying in the right hotels, when you're eating at the right restaurants, when you're frequenting the right establishments." "Rick, please." David's voice was barely a whisper. But there was no mercy in Rick's face. November 15th, the Fontainebleau Hotel, pool deck, around 2 p.m. "Ring any bells, David?" I watched in fascination and horror as my brother seemed to shrink in his chair. This man who had just called me a failure, who had spent years making me feel small and inadequate, was falling apart before my eyes. "What's going on?" Dad demanded, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in his 30 years as a high school principal. "Rick, if you have something to say it." Rick never took his eyes off David. "Your son wasn't working in Miami, Jim. He was on vacation. A very private vacation." Sarah's fork clattered to her plate. "What do you mean, vacation? David was working. He called me every night. He told me about the meetings, the negotiations. He lied." The words were simple, brutal, and absolute. There was no merger deal. There was no conference. I checked with Henderson and Associates myself. They had no events scheduled in Miami that month. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Mom's face had gone ashen, and Dad looked like someone had just told him the world was flat. But it was Sarah's expression that broke my heart. The confusion, the dawning realization, the way her face crumpled as the implications hit her. That's impossible," she whispered. "The promotion, the bonus—" "Oh, the promotion was real," Rick said, his voice carrying a terrible satisfaction. "Question is, how did he really get it?" David made a sound like a wounded animal. "Stop. Please. Just stop." But Rick was merciless. "Tell them, David. Tell them who you were really with in Miami. Tell them about the photos I have. Tell them about, I was having an affair." The words exploded out of David like a dam bursting, desperate and raw and full of panic. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's gasp cut through the air like a knife. "What?" David's hands were covering his face now, his shoulders shaking. When he spoke, his voice was muffled and broken. "I was having an affair with Patricia Caldwell. She's a partner at the firm." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. I could see the recognition in her eyes. She'd heard that name before, probably at company parties, probably as David talked about work. "Patricia?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "But she's married. She has children." "I know." David's voice was hollow, defeated. "I know, and I did it anyway." Mom made a small, wounded sound. Dad just stared at his son like he was looking at a stranger. "How long?" Sarah asked. And there was something terrible in her voice now, something cold and sharp that I'd never heard from her before. David was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he whispered, 8 months. 8 months. Not a moment of weakness, not a mistake. A sustained betrayal that had been going on while Sarah was home with their children, while she was supporting his career, while she was building their life together. "The promotion," she said, and now I could hear the pieces clicking into place in her mind. You got the promotion because of her. Sarah, you've been sleeping with a senior partner for 8 months, and she gave you the promotion. Her voice was getting stronger now, fueled by rage and hurt and betrayal. How many times have I supported your career? How many dinner parties have I hosted? How many times have I taken care of everything so you could focus on work? Jake and Emma were looking between their parents with the wide, frightened eyes of children who know something terrible is happening but don't understand what. Emma started to cry. Quiet little sobs that broke my heart. "Kids," Mom said quickly, standing up. "Why don't you come help Grandma get dessert ready?" But they didn't move. They sat frozen, watching their perfect family world crumble around them. Rick was still watching David with those cold, calculating eyes. "There's more, isn't there, David?" "No," David said quickly. "No, that's it. That's everything." But Rick shook his head slowly. "I don't think it is. See, I did some digging after I saw you in Miami, made some phone calls, had some interesting conversations." David's face went gray. "Rick, you don't understand. The Henderson account," Rick continued relentlessly, "the one you supposedly landed that got you the promotion? It wasn't your account at all, was it?" I saw something die in David's eyes. The last vestige of fight, of hope, of the ability to maintain any part of his carefully constructed lie. "Whose account was it, David?" Rick's voice was soft now, but somehow that made it more terrifying. "Johnson's," David whispered. "It was Tom Johnson's account." Sarah's head snapped up. "Tom? Your friend Tom? The one who got fired last month for allegedly losing a major client," Rick finished. "Except he didn't lose that client, did he, David? You stole it. You used your relationship with Patricia to undermine him, to make it look like he was incompetent, and then you swooped in to save the day." The full picture was coming together now, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. My brother, the man who had just called me a failure, was a liar, a cheat, and a backstabber who had destroyed a friend's career to advance his own. "Tom has 3 kids, Sarah said, her voice hollow. "His wife is pregnant with their 4th. You got him fired right before the holidays." "I didn't mean for that to happen," David said, but the words sounded pathetic even to him. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" Rick's voice was sharp again. "You didn't mean to steal his account. You didn't mean to sleep with Patricia. You didn't mean to lie to your wife for 8 months? Which part was the accident, David?" Dad finally found his voice, but it came out rough and strained. "David, how could you do this? This isn't how we raised you." And that's when David snapped. The fear and shame twisted into something ugly, something desperate, and he turned on. "The closest target he could find, me. At least I tried," he screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "At least I didn't just give up and become a starving artist. At least I didn't disappoint everyone by throwing my life away on some stupid dream." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. This man who had just been exposed as a fraud, a cheat, and a liar was still trying to make me the villain. But before I could respond, Rick's voice cut through the air like a whip. "You want to talk about disappointment, David? Let's talk about real disappointment. Let's talk about what Tom Johnson's wife said when I called to tell her what really happened to her husband's job." "You called her?" David's voice cracked with panic. Someone had to tell her the truth. Someone had to let her know that her husband lost his job not because he was incompetent, but because he was betrayed by someone he trusted. Rick's voice was getting louder now, angrier. "Do you know what she's going through right now? Do you care that they might lose their house? That she's wondering how they're going to feed their children? That's not my fault. It's exactly your fault." Rick slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes jump. "Everything that's happened is your fault. The affair, the lies, the destruction of a good man's career, all of it." Sarah had gone very still, very quiet. When she spoke, her voice was calm in a way that was somehow more terrifying than screaming would have been. I want you out of the house by tomorrow, she said. Sarah, please, we can work this out. No. Her voice was final, absolute. No. We can't. 8 months, David. 8 months of lies. And you destroyed Tom's life to cover for your affair. There's no coming back from this. She stood up slowly, gathering Emma into her arms. Jake followed, clinging to his mother's side, both, children crying now. Kids, say goodbye to your father, she said quietly. You won't be seeing him for a while. The pain in those children's faces was devastating. They didn't understand what was happening, but they understood that their world had just ended. A's. Sarah carried them toward the door. She paused and looked back at David one last time. And David? If you think I'm going to let you anywhere near my children after this, you're even more delusional than I thought. The front door closed behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. David sat alone at the table, his perfect life in ruins around him. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than anger. Felt sorry for him. But that feeling lasted exactly as long as it took for him to open his mouth again. This is all your fault, he said, his voice bitter and broken. If you hadn't provoked me, if you had just accepted what you are, what I am. I stood up slowly, feeling something inside me shift and settle into place. What I am, David, is someone who chose to follow her dreams instead of destroying other people to get what she wanted. What I am is someone who's never lied to the people she loves. What I am is someone who can look at herself in the mirror without feeling sick. I walked around the table until I was standing right in front of him, looking down at this man who had terrorized my self-confidence for years. You called me a failure, I said quietly. But look around, David. Look at what you've done. You've lost your wife, your children, your integrity, your friend, and your family's respect. If anyone at this table is a failure, it sure as hell isn't me. But even as I said the words, even as I felt the satisfaction of finally standing up to him, I knew this wasn't over, because Rick hadn't told us everything yet. I could see it in his eyes, could feel it in the way he was watching David with that predatory patience. There was more. Something bigger. Something worse. And as David sat there in the wreckage of his life, I had the terrible feeling that the worst was yet to come. The house felt hollow after Sarah and the kids left, like someone had sucked all the warmth out of it. David sat slumped in his chair, staring at his untouched plate, and for a moment I almost felt bad for him. Almost. But then I remembered the way he'd looked at me when he called me a failure, the contempt in his voice, the years of making me feel small and worthless. And I remembered that everything that had happened to him, he'd brought on himself. Mom was crying quietly, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Dad just sat there looking, stunned, like he couldn't quite process what his perfect son had become. And Rick. Rick was still watching David with those calculating eyes, like a cat that hadn't finished playing with its mouse. Well, David said finally, his voice hollow and defeated. I guess you got what you wanted, Rick. You destroyed my life. Are you happy now? Rick leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely sad. David, he said quietly, I didn't destroy your life. You did that all by yourself. I just refuse to let you destroy your sister's spirit in the process. My sister's spirit? David laughed bitterly. She's a grown woman living in a fantasy world. Someone needed to tell her the truth. The truth? Rick's voice sharpened again. You want to talk about truth? Because we're not done yet, are we, David? We haven't talked about the real reason you were so desperate to tear Amber down tonight. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in Rick's tone, something that suggested we'd only scratched the surface of David's deception. What are you talking about? I asked, but even as I said it, I could see the fear creeping back into David's eyes. Rick stood up slowly, pulling out his phone. David, do you remember what you asked me about 6 months ago? That favor you needed? David's face went white. Rick, don't. You called me, desperate, said you needed help with something delicate, something that required discretion. Please, David whispered, and I could hear genuine terror in his voice now. What favor? Dad demanded, his principal voice cutting through the tension. Rick looked at each of us in turn, then back at David. He asked me to investigate his sister. He wanted dirt on Amber's business, her clients, her finances. He wanted me to find proof that she was failing so he could... Rick paused, letting the words sink in. What was it you said, David? So you could help the family stage an intervention? The words hit me like a physical blow. What? I refused, obviously, Rick continued. Told him he was sick for even thinking about sabotaging his own sister. But that didn't stop him, did it, David? I stared at my brother in horror. You tried to sabotage my business? It wasn't sabotage, David said quickly, but his voice lacked any conviction. I was trying to protect you from making a huge mistake. Bullshit. The word exploded out of me. What did you do, David? What did you do to my business? Rick pulled up something on his phone, then showed it to me. It was an email chain, and as I read it, I felt sick to my stomach. 3 months ago, Rick said, David contacted several potential clients of yours, people who had inquired about your services. He told them you were unreliable, unprofessional, that you'd had mental health issues that made you unsuitable for business. No, I whispered, but the evidence was right there on the screen. Jennifer Martinez, Rick read from his phone. The restaurant owner who was going to hire you to redesign her brand identity. David convinced her you'd had a breakdown and couldn't be trusted with a major project. I remembered Jennifer. We'd had such a good meeting, and I'd been so excited about the project. Then she'd suddenly gone cold, stopped returning my calls, hired someone else without explanation. Marcus Thompson from Thompson Real Estate, Rick continued. Another client David contacted, told him you were financially desperate and would probably overcharge and underdeliver. Marcus, the real estate developer who was going to be my biggest client ever, who'd mysteriously changed his mind at the last minute. How many? I asked, my voice barely audible. Rick looked at David with disgust. Show her the spreadsheet. Spreadsheet? Mom's voice was horrified. David kept a list, Rick said when David didn't respond. Every potential client Amber mentioned on social media or in family conversations. He systematically contacted them, spreading lies, destroying her reputation before she even had a chance to build it. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. All those missed opportunities. All those potential clients who'd seemed interested and then vanished. All those months I'd struggled, wondering what I was doing wrong, why I couldn't seem to get traction. It wasn't because I was failing. It was because my own brother was sabotaging me. 17 clients, Rick said quietly. 17 businesses he contacted over the past 4 months. Conservative estimate of lost revenue, around $40,000. $40,000. That would have changed everything for me. That would have been enough to build a real foundation for my business. To feel secure and confident instead of constantly worried about making rent. Why? The word came out as a sob. Why would you do that to me? David couldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, his voice barely audible. Because I couldn't stand watching you succeed at something I was too scared to try. The honesty of, it was devastating. Not because it explained anything, but because it made it somehow worse. You were jealous, I said, and it wasn't a question. Yes, he whispered. Yes, I was jealous. You had the courage to walk away from security, to follow your passion, to risk everything for something you believed in. and I was stuck in a job I hated, married to a woman I'd grown to resent, living a life that felt like a prison. So you decided to destroy mine? I thought if you failed, if you came crawling back to a regular job, then I wouldn't have to face what a coward I was. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom was openly weeping now, and Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. But it was Rick who spoke first. "There's more," he said quietly. More? How could there possibly be more? "The promotion at your firm," Rick continued, looking at David. "The one Patricia Caldwell gave you. It wasn't just because of your affair with her, was it?" David's head snapped up, panic flooding his face again. "What are you talking about?" "Tom Johnson's client," Rick said. "The Henderson account you stole? How did you know about Tom's strategy meetings? How did you know exactly what to say to Patricia to make Tom look incompetent?" I watched my brother's face crumble as he realized where this was going. "You were recording him, weren't you?" Rick's voice was flat, matter of fact. "Your friend, Tom, the man who trusted you, who confided in you about his work problems, who asked for your advice. You were recording your private conversations and using them to destroy him." "That's illegal," Dad said, his voice hollow. "Yes," Rick agreed. "It is. Corporate espionage, invasion of privacy, fraud. Tom could press charges. Probably should press. Charges?" David looked like he was going to be sick. "You can't tell him. Please, Rick, you can't." "Can't tell him what? That his best friend betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible? That everything he confided to you was used as a weapon against him?" "I'll lose everything," David pleaded. "My career, my license." "You've already lost everything," Rick said coldly. "Your wife, your kids, your integrity? What's a career built on lies and betrayal compared to that?" I stared at my brother, this man I'd looked up to my entire life, and realized I didn't know him at all. The person sitting across from me was a stranger, someone capable of a level of calculated cruelty I couldn't have imagined. "How long have you been like this?" I asked quietly. "How long have you been this person?" David looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine remorse in his eyes. "I don't know," he said honestly. I think it happened gradually. One small compromise, one little lie, one corner cut, and before I knew it, I'd become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who would destroy his own sister's dreams out of jealousy, I said. Yes. Someone who would betray his best friend for a promotion. Yes. Someone who would lie to his wife for 8 months while having an affair. Yes. His voice broke on the word. I stood up slowly, looking down at this broken man who had once been my hero. You know what, David? You were right about one thing tonight. I am different from you. I am someone who builds things instead of tearing them down. I am someone who faces her fears instead of destroying other people to avoid them. I am someone who tells the truth even when it's hard. I walked to the window, looking out at the street where Sarah had driven away with his children. And you know what else I am? I'm someone who's going to rebuild everything you tried to destroy. I'm going to contact every single client on your list, tell them the truth about what you did, and ask for a second chance. Some of them might give it to me, some might not. But I'm going to try, because that's what people with integrity do. When I turned back to face him, David was crying. Real tears, not the manipulative kind, but the kind that come from finally understanding the magnitude of what you've lost. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Amber. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. And you know what? For the first time all night, I believed him. I know you are, I said quietly, but sorry doesn't give me back 4 months of sabotaged opportunities. Sorry doesn't give Tom his job back. Sorry doesn't give your kids their father back. Rick put his phone away and looked at David with something that might have been pity. "I've already spoken to Tom," he said quietly. "Told him everything. He's deciding whether to press charges." David nodded, accepting his fate with a resignation that was somehow more heartbreaking than his earlier panic. "What about Patricia?" Mom asked, her voice shaky. "I'm sure her husband will be very interested to know where she was during that Miami conference," Rick said, "along with the partners at the firm who don't know about the affair that influenced a major promotion." David's career wasn't just over, it was obliterated, and he'd done it all to himself. As the reality of his situation sank in, David stood up slowly, moving like an old man. "I should go," he said quietly. I need to figure out where I'm going to live." Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody offered him a place to stay. The man who had walked into this house a few hours ago as the golden child was leaving as a pariah, and it was entirely his own doing. At the door, he turned back one last time. "Amber," he said, "I know you have no reason to forgive me, but I want you to know I'm proud of you. I always have been. Your courage, your integrity, your willingness to risk everything for your dreams. That's everything I wish I could be." And then he was gone, walking out into the cold November night with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his own choices. The three of us sat in silence for a long time after he left. Finally, Rick spoke. "I'm sorry you had to. See that?" he said to Mom and Dad. But he needed to be stopped. What he was doing to Amber, to Tom, to his own family, it couldn't continue. "You did the right thing," Dad said, though his voice was heavy with grief. "It was hard, but it was right." Mom just nodded, too emotionally exhausted to speak. I looked at Rick, this man who had stood up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself, who had seen through David's facade when the rest of us were still blinded by his carefully constructed image. "Thank you," I said simply. He smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a genuinely warm expression. "You don't need to thank me for telling the truth," he said. "That should be the default, not the exception." Later that night, after Mom and Dad had gone to bed and Rick had headed back to his hotel, I sat alone in the kitchen where this whole nightmare had started. The dishes were still on the table, the turkey still carved but mostly uneaten, the sweet potatoes I'd worried about that morning now cold and forgotten. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jennifer Martinez, the restaurant owner whose business David had sabotaged. "Amber, I just got a very strange call from your uncle. Can we talk tomorrow? I think there might have been some misunderstanding about our project." Then another text from Marcus Thompson. "Hi, Amber. Got an interesting call tonight about some misinformation someone spread about your business. Would you be available to discuss that project we talked about? I think I made a mistake." And another. Rick hadn't just exposed David's lies. He'd already started fixing them. I looked around at the ruins of what had been our family Thanksgiving, at the evidence of how spectacularly David's perfect life had imploded. And I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt free. For years, I'd carried the weight of David's disapproval, his subtle and not-so-subtle messages that I wasn't good enough, successful enough, conventional enough. I'd internalized his judgment, let it feed my own insecurities and self-doubt. But tonight, I'd seen the truth behind the judgment. David hadn't been succeeding. He'd been cheating, lying, and destroying other people to create the illusion of success. His criticism of me hadn't come from a place of superior knowledge or achievement. It had come from jealousy, fear, and his own deep-seated sense of inadequacy. I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document. If I was going to rebuild what David had tried to destroy, I needed a plan. I needed to contact every client on his list, tell them the truth, and ask for a second chance. Some would say yes, some would say no, But at least now I'd know that any failure would be mine, not the result of sabotage. More importantly, I'd know that any success would be mine too. As I started typing, I thought about what David had said at the end. That he was proud of my courage, my integrity, my willingness to risk everything for my dreams. The irony was that those were exactly the qualities that would help me survive this betrayal and come back stronger. By the time the sun came up on Black Friday, I had a plan. By the time the weekend was over, I'd reached out to half the clients on David's list. By the end of the following week, I'd gotten 3 new projects and meetings scheduled with 4 more potential clients. My brother had tried to destroy my dreams out of jealousy and fear, but he'd forgotten one crucial thing. About me, I'd always been a fighter. I'd always been someone who got back up when life knocked me down. And now that I knew the truth about his so-called success, now that I understood that his judgment of me had been rooted in his own failures and insecurities, rather than any real shortcomings on my part, I was stronger than I'd ever been. 6 months later, my business was thriving. I'd not only recovered from David's sabotage, I'd surpassed where I would have been if he'd never interfered at all. Because the truth has a way of coming out, and when people learned what had happened, many of them went out of their way to support me. David, meanwhile, had lost his law license, his career, and any hope of reconciliation with his family. Tom Johnson decided not to press criminal charges, but the civil lawsuit was still pending. Patricia Caldwell had been forced to resign from her firm when the affair came to light, and her husband had filed for divorce. I didn't take any pleasure in their downfall, but I didn't feel sorry for them either. They were living with the consequences of their choices, just like I was living with the consequences of mine. And you know what? I liked my consequences a whole lot better. The next Thanksgiving was different. David wasn't there. He was living across the country, trying to rebuild his life from scratch. Sarah brought the kids, though, and they seemed to be healing. She'd started dating someone new, a kind man who treated her children like they were precious gifts. Rick was there, too. With stories from his latest assignment and photos that took our breath away. And me, I was there as myself. Not as David's disappointing little sister, not as the family failure, but as Amber. A successful business owner, a woman who'd faced betrayal and emerged stronger, someone who'd learned that the opinions of others, even family, mattered far less than the opinion I had of myself. During Grace that year, Dad thanked God for truth, for family, and for second chances. As I looked around that table at the people who truly loved and supported me, I realized that sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most profound blessings. Sometimes you have to lose the family. You thought you had to find the family. You actually have. And sometimes being called a failure by someone who's actually failing is the best thing that can happen to you. Because it forces you to prove them wrong, not to them, but to yourself. And that, it turns out, makes all the difference.